What is art?
Art is
history.
What is art? That's a good question.
This is Art Uncovered.
Art is our collective cultural history.
A weekly podcast that brings you interviews with an eclectic mix of artists and creators.
Art is
Disappointing your parents.
I'm your host, Kimberly. Happy Tuesday, everyone. Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode of Art Uncovered. This week I was honored to speak with Allison DeBritz, an artist and educator whose work intimately considers the gendered paradigms of domestic spaces and relationships through an interdisciplinary feminist lens. Over the course of the conversation, we talk about Allison's work with found images, photography, and collage, and her media's relationship to conversations surrounding women's reproductive rights. Stay with us. Welcome back, listeners. Thanks again for tuning in to this week's episode of Art Uncovered. This week, I am so honored to be here with Allison DeBritz from upstate New York. Allison, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's interesting. We have a little bit of it. I don't remember meeting you back in the day,
Yeah.
but apparently I was teaching in the photo department and you were an undergrad at that point.
Yep.
You weren't one of my students, but we have SUNY New Paltz in common. So, and I didn't realize that before we agreed to chat. So it's a really nice kind of connection there.
Definitely.
So you're largely a photo-based artist. You also teach photography at a number of universities. So the first project that I would like to talk about is photo-based. And it is a project that is titled Your Fingers Have No Muscles. So I'm wondering, maybe to start the talk, if you could tell us a bit about some of the ideas you were exploring in Your Fingers Have No Muscles.
Yeah, absolutely. So this project went on for a couple of years and it sort of changed and it languished at a few points. So it's evolved quite a bit. When I first started working on it, I was thinking a lot about women and healing, specifically from trauma, physical trauma, and trauma that comes from being part of a medical system that generally disregards the pain of women. As I was working on it, there was so much happening in contemporary politics and discourse about reproductive rights. Roe v. Wade was overturned, and I was really inspired to take it in a more serious direction regarding abortion rights and access to reproductive health. I was listening to a lot of podcasts about women telling their stories of not having access to abortion and healthcare, and also experiences of pain while they were trying to access healthcare or reproductive healthcare. So that really became the main concept for this work. And that fueled me to sort of get the project to a point that I was happy with. I was making a lot of images for a long time that I was just like, I don't know, I wasn't loving. But when I narrowed down my focus to be more specifically about reproductive rights and abortion access, I really was fueled to make these images and sort of change from a photo-based process into collage. So like you said, all image-based, but I was really using my scanner as my camera rather than taking pictures. Yeah,
listening to you talk about the project, it seems like you did quite a bit of research, and without looking at your images, I would have kind of assumed that you were talking about more documentary style photography. Now, the images that you ended up using, so you would find images, or would you take images and then scan them in? What was your process of
finding images? So I was on a hunt for images that were inspiring, mostly of the female body, medical-based images. So going to a lot of thrift stores and looking for very niche things like book about like the history of gynecology, and I actually did find some of those, but like really random. Definitely probably scared some people at my like checkout, at the thrift stores with my book choices. But all found imagery. And then some of it would come from magazines and stuff, but generally speaking, books, photo books. And then I also use medical archives for some images. So there's some things that would come from just the internet. And I would add those in later. So the process was really finding photos, cutting them up, scanning them, taking that scan into Photoshop, and then potentially adding other images to them. And so some of the medical archive images never came off the internet. They were always just digital, and then eventually would end up in the Photoshop document. So it's kind of like a two-step process, one in the scanner and then the second step in Photoshop.
What was it like for you to begin thinking of the scanner as the camera?
Yeah, I mean, I love the scanner. I actually started using it in undergrad, and I've always found it really interesting. So it's something that I've done before, but this is the first time that I relied on it fully as my camera, and stepped away from making images in a more traditional sense. And I think it's so fun. I really love the immediacy of working in photography and image-based media. I can make something and see it and get that feedback instantly. And so the scanner is just another way to do that. But it feels more tactile a lot of the times than taking pictures because I'm physically cutting things and moving them and arranging them. So I really love the scanner. I think it's so much fun and really just opens up a totally different mode of working.
I could you see yourself, and I don't know if I'm phrasing this in the right way, but I'll try to just be as honest as possible. Do you think that, like, what do you think the work would look like if you use a traditional camera? And actually, maybe I don't like, let me rephrase that because I don't want to, how do you think the work would change if you used a traditional camera versus the scanner?
Yeah, that's a good question. When I started this project, I was using my camera, and in a lot of ways, the images looked somewhat similar because I was using a similar color palette and I was also using the same source material. But I find a little bit more freedom in some ways when I'm working on a scanner, because I can Photoshop more. I mean, I will make collages from photographs that I've made. That's definitely something that I've done in the past, but there seems to be more like wiggle room in some ways when I'm scanning things, because I'm not limited to like what I can set up in my studio. You know, I can use images of things that already exist and create the images. When I'm photographing, I'm mostly in my studio and I have a space limitation and a depth limitation, and I, only have a certain number of objects available to me and things like that. So in some ways, I actually feel like slightly more limited when I use a camera.
And I'm curious about your kind of path towards collage, because especially in like when we start, the photography track in art school, we learn how to use cameras and taking picture of the world in front of us. So this is, as you mentioned, a departure from traditional photography. Was it this concept of talking about women's health and women's choices that brought you to collage, or was it something that you experimented with before and then felt like this this content would work well in a collage?
Yeah, I've been doing collage for a long time.
Okay.
So my mom is an artist and so is my grandmother. And so I grew up making art. I found a notebook recently where I wrote, I am Allison DeBritz. I'm 11 and I'm an artist.
Oh
So
my
like
gosh, that's so
I
sweet.
had a very strong sense of art and, self and being an artist at a young age. And so actually in high school, when I was taking art classes, I was working mostly in collage, like physical collage, using fashion magazines and looking at representation of women in pop culture and media. And then I took a photo class and I really enjoyed it. And I kind of decided that photo was sort of this bridge between fashion and art, that I was trying to figure out a way to close. I thought I wanted to be a fashion photographer, but then I went to New Paltz and I got tricked into becoming a fine artist. So I realized that wasn't what I wanted to do after college. But Yeah, so I've been doing collage for a long time, and even my undergrad thesis had elements of collage in it.
Mm.
My graduate thesis, elements of collage. I think this is the first series that I've made where I've really let myself just go like 100% collage and not feel this sense of guilt for not using my camera. That does happen sometimes, where I'm like, I'm a photographer, I should be using my camera, you know? Um, and yeah, it just made sense. It was a fast way to make this work that had sort of been like bubbling up inside me for a really long time, and I was just ready to make it. And I was able to do it relatively quickly, and like I said, get that feedback in my own process. And so it just sort of happened naturally, but because collage is a very familiar medium for me.
Hmm. I'm curious if maybe we could chat a little bit more about the sense of guilt that you felt by
Yeah.
not using your camera. Can you
Yeah.
talk about that a little bit more?
Yeah, absolutely. I've dedicated a lot of my life to becoming a photographer, right? Like I have a BFA and an MFA in photo, and I've
Mm.
known for a long time that this is what I wanted to do. And so sometimes I feel like I'm maybe like it's a cop out to not make my work through using a camera. And I also experience often people in the photo community not understanding my work because it's not made in a traditional way.
Mm.
It's not straight photography. I think of it as photography. I'm using images. Like it doesn't get much more photos than that. Like images are always the base of my work. But yeah, sometimes I think that I'm taking like an easy way out by making a collage because it's so natural to me. And not that photography isn't, but I just find it sometimes harder to make what I want to make while taking a picture.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, I think, I experience a lot of guilt as an artist. And I think that's kind of common, but
It
like,
is.
you're not spending enough time in the studio. You're not applying for enough stuff. You're not working hard enough. You're not working long enough, all that stuff. And those are things that I've been working on unraveling and sort of fighting against because nothing kills creativity faster than that.
Mhm.
Um, so with this work, just leaned into it and I was like, this is the way that this is happening. And I love it and it's working for me and I'm going to embrace it. And then I'm going to deal with everything else afterwards.
Good
So
for you. I'm curious
thanks.
about the size of these. Is there any like
Mhm.
upscaling, or are they true to size?
Yeah. So they mostly have lived online at this point. I recently, within the last couple of months, printed them for some crit groups that I'm in, but I
Cool.
think that ideally they would be bigger, like, at least 24 inches tall, if not larger than that. Um, one thing that I do really love about like making collage and photo is that I have the ability to change the size of things. I always find it really hard in open calls to say what the dimensions are because
Yeah.
it's like, well, it could be anything. I'm not like married to a specific size for most of my work. I also view this as eventually being a more site specific installation.
Oh, cool.
So having the work responding to the space that it's in. Um, so yeah, I think that they would be a lot larger than they're probably perceived as online, but there's the ability to size them up, so I have flexibility.
Yeah, so you mentioned there that currently these live online, and I
Hmm.
think this might be an interesting point to talk about a. It's not really a full body of work, but it's kind of a collection of
Hmm.
images that are currently on your website, and the title of them is "Baby Don't Quit," which
Hmm.
is from this past year, 2023.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because they look very similar to the images of "Your Fingers Have No Muscles,"
Hmm.
but there are slight variations, and that it seemed to me you use some original images as well as found
Hmm.
images.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if maybe you could talk about kind of what this collection of images, where they came from, and maybe how they differ
Yeah.
from the series we just spoke about.
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, they are similar. They were made sort of in parallel to the other images. Um, as I mentioned, Your Fingers Have No Muscles was sort of a long project and it took a lot of twists and turns. It was the first like major thing I was working on post grad school. which it's been almost 3 years since I graduated, but like it doesn't feel like it's been that long. And artists will understand, like, you have a job and you have other things you have to do, and unfortunately oftentimes making art, takes a back burner. So I was sort of navigating what it was like to have a practice and be a working artist. And so these images felt really important because they were, they were what happened before the images that are now the final series of Your Fingers Have No Muscles. But they felt visually pretty different. Also, the process of making them was different in that they did involve my camera more. So I think all of them have a picture in it that I made. And then some of them have found imagery added into them, like the first one of the bathroom, like that photo I took. And then the image that's superimposed on top is a found image. So there are these really important images that I like, that I'm interested in, that feel important, that are new and relevant to what I'm doing, but they started to stand out when they were with the other images and just feel like very different. And not that a series has to be totally homogenous, and that's not really my style anyways. But it felt like they were strong enough to kind of pull out on their own. So, they don't have maybe as much conceptual backing as the other images. I don't even have an artist statement that's super specific to these photos, but they feel important. And I've struggled a little bit to figure out, like, what goes online, what doesn't, how finished does something have to be before you share it with the world. And, back when I started my art Instagram, I think it was like 2015, I sort of thought of it as a sketchbook. Like, I would just make stuff and I would post it, and it wasn't always done. And sometimes it never became anything. Sometimes it was just like a sketch essentially of something I was thinking about. And I kind of like that idea of sharing things as they're in process and not sort of gatekeeping all the work that we're making. It's a very individual choice, I think, to like share your process that openly. But I don't know, I'm kind of tired of artists pretending like they have it together all the time, right? And that we have all these answers. And my students ask me these questions, and it's like, I'm still thinking about the same things they're asking me. Like, when is the project done? Like, how many more images do I need for it? Like, things like that. And so I just decided I like these photos. I think they're good. I think they're a representation of myself as an artist and what I'm making. So I'm going to put them on my website.
Own it.
Yeah.
Own it.
Yeah.
Do you see a difference between like your Instagram art page versus your website? Do you view them as two different, I don't know, even like, obviously they're two different platforms, but do you view your work or make choices differently based on posting on one versus the other?
Yeah, I think so. My Instagram definitely shows a lot more of my process. I don't always, I post a decent amount, but I'm not regularly posting stuff because I don't always have finished work or work that's even like anywhere near the point of wanting to share. And sometimes I do share things in process, like I just said, but I think my posts tend to be more like finished work. But I put a lot of stuff on my story, like when I'm doing random stuff in the studio. Like today I was making paper and I was posting, about that process. Yeah, it was really fun. And I put like highlight reels and things like that because process is like 99% of it, right? The finished product is like that 1%. So I think of my Instagram as being like slightly chaotic. I think when you look at my feed, you're sort of assaulted by like color and things like that. And I like that. I think my website is a little bit more digestible. You see less at once. Things are sort of sectioned out more clearly. It's like slightly more professional, I guess you could say. But I really do like sharing my process on Instagram, and I find that to be really fun. And I like it when people like message me and they're like, "Oh, this is cool. What are you doing?"
The informal nature of it is so, I don't know, it's freeing. Like, I feel like on our website, we have to, explain everything and artist
Yeah,
statements, and it has to be
right.
considered complete in order to be up there.
Yeah,
That's why I think I really
exactly.
appreciate what you're doing here. It feels kind of like a bold move to put
Hmm.
an unfinished
Thanks.
project on a
Yeah,
website. And
yeah.
honestly, I love them. Listener, I haven't
Mm.
mentioned this yet, listeners, but we're recording this conversation on YouTube also, and there were a couple of moments already that I showed Allison's website. So if you want some visuals for what we've been talking about, head over to YouTube. We're on Art Uncovered podcast. And I actually just realized there's another Art Uncovered on YouTube, which is
Oh.
more like art history, but we're the
Mm.
one that says Art Uncovered podcast. But yeah, I really love what's happening here. It's such an interesting
Thank you.
combination of, found footage versus your own.
Hmm.
It's, I don't know, it's like these collapsing of these familiar spaces. Like in the
Mm-hmm.
first one, we were mentioning, like, it looks like a very feminine domestic bathroom. And then
Yeah.
the second one also feels very feminine, largely because of the color palette. It looks like it could be like fabric that we would find in a still life arrangement or
Hmm.
something like this. So I think the sense of space is really interesting
Yeah.
here. And I have
Thank
no
you.
idea what direction you're going to go in, but I'm really glad that you posted them in this state because
Thanks.
yeah, they're fabulous. One
Thank
thing I
you.
do want to mention for those listeners who are listening as opposed to watching, if we could kind of describe your palette a little bit.
Yeah,
Um,
definitely.
yeah, so it's very a lot of pink and a lot of purple.
Hmm.
Can you
Yeah, a lot
explain?
of pink.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, pink is my favorite color. So, if you are watching this, you can see I'm wearing pink and I have like pink light in the background like that. I just love pink. Like it just makes me very happy. Um, but I don't actually wear that much pink. Interestingly enough, I think a lot of my love for it comes out more in my art. But it's always been my favorite color, and I just think there is such an interesting um sort of like cultural phenomenon around the color, what it's associated with femininity, sort of passivity, this idea that it's prescribed to girls, things like that. When you walk down the girls' toy aisle at Target, it looks very different than the boys' toy aisle. And, I think some of those gender binaries are um, going away, but it still has like a really strong association with femininity. And then when you put it in my work, it's juxtaposed by these things that are sometimes kind of graphic, and
Oh my goodness,
gross
sweet.
and maybe violent. Um, and there's a lot of anger that is happening in my work as well, because that's how I feel when I'm making it. And so there's this sort of tension that comes from this color that we expect to be sort of passive and feminine, put up against some of these concepts that I'm thinking about. So I really like that play that comes from that. And this idea too that people might be lured into my work because they like the color palette and then be sort of jolted into realizing what it's actually about. Um, I want to kind of seduce people into like having to think more about it.
Mm. You mentioned there that you're oftentimes angry when you're making work.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that?
Yeah, definitely. So a lot of the things that I consume, media and things like that, that inform my work, as I mentioned, like podcasts is a big one. I read a lot of feminist literature and philosophy, and a lot of stories written by women about women, specifically relating to abortion access and reproductive health. And I am constantly enraged by what I'm consuming. I don't know how healthy that is, but it's just how I feel. And even things that I see on Instagram that are more casual, like I'm always sort of connecting it back to these concepts. And so, when I'm actually in my studio making the work, I'm very happy, right? Like I listen to music constantly, like I get in the zone, I'm not paying attention to my phone. So in the moment I'm very like excited by what I'm doing, but the undertone is this anger that I have about what's going on in this country, and how women and people with reproductive organs are being treated. So female reproductive organs, I should say. Yeah, so there is an anger in it, and I think it's impossible to separate out from the work.
So also on your website, Allison, is you have some sculptural work in
Hmm.
here also. Yeah, and it's interesting. Listener, I'm going to do a screen share here.
Hmm.
If you can maybe walk me to where the sculptures are. So I'm going to your work page, and then nice, there's a tab that says sculptures.
Yep.
Okay, so when I first looked at these, I was
Hmm.
wondering, because it's titled sculptures, but it looks like they were kind of sculptures made for photography,
Hmm.
because the background seems like the color of the background was very carefully chosen. It's also
Hmm.
pink,
Hmm.
and it very much represents like still life kind of arrangements.
Yeah.
Uh, but the sculptures themselves seem a bit abstract. So I'm kind of
Hmm.
torn in my perception of whether this is sculpture for photo or just sculpture for sculpture's sake.
Yeah.
Can you tell us what you were thinking here?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so you're not the first person to ask, is this a documentation of a sculpture or is this a photograph?
Yeah, exactly.
Um, and originally it was meant to be the documentation of sculptures, but these forms themselves, they exist, but they don't look like this anymore because I wasn't working with the most stable materials.
Mm.
Um, so it's sort of turned into both, actually. It is a documentation of what I made, but really what lives on is the photo. So this was last summer that I was doing this, and it was something that I had kind of been quietly working on and way too scared to show or tell anybody because I was like, I am not a sculptor. Like, I do not know what I'm doing. I work two dimensionally, you know. Um, and I truly had no idea if they were good or not. And so I was in a crit group last summer with the New York City Crit Club, and I was with a group of artists that were a lot of them were working three dimensionally, and very few, if any, were working with photo based mediums. So I took that as an opportunity to share the sculptures, and I
Oh.
got some good feedback. And I was like, okay, like maybe these aren't too bad, you know? And it just sort of gave me like a little bit of validation to keep going with it. And so those, like I was working on them over the summer, but I was kind of bumping up against some issues in terms of what materials to use. When you're working with sculpture, like there's so many options, and things can get really expensive. And so I was feeling frustrated by not being able to figure out what material I want to make things from in order to make them last. And so I took a break from that and sort of went back to my collage and finished that project we just talked about. And now I'm sort of sneaking back over to like making objects. But I think I realized that I want to make them for the camera, because then I sort of remove that barrier of making something that is archival or at least somewhat stable. I think that I could eventually make objects that live as objects. I'm always interested in trying to figure out how to make images into objects. Um, I've done I did some of that with my like MFA thesis exhibition installation.
You said
And
how
so
to turn objects into, or how to change something from a photograph into an object. Was that the
yes,
right?
yeah,
Okay.
yeah. I don't know if that's what I said, but that's what I meant.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So taking a
it was.
photograph, yeah, taking a photograph and turning it into an object. Like,
Hmm.
yeah, so I don't like the idea of just like having prints like neatly hanging on a wall. There's just something about that that like it just doesn't work for me. I've seen plenty of work done in that manner that's fantastic, but I don't think it works for my work. So I'm always trying to figure out like how can I make an image into an object. And so um I think I might end up like making objects and then somehow getting an image onto them and then maybe photographing them and then maybe the photograph and the object live on, maybe just the photograph of the object with a photograph lives on. I don't know yet. I'm in like super early stages of experimenting with this. Um, but it's really interesting to venture so far away from your comfort zone in terms of medium that you're working with because it feels crazy. and really scary, but I'm enjoying it. And I like the immediacy of the materials I was working with. It was a lot of beeswax, plaster, some resin, which is not as fast, but beeswax and plaster, you can really work pretty quickly with. And I just enjoy being able to make something. Same thing with the photos, like make something and see it be done and there like instantly, yeah. So then I photographed them.
Yeah, I'm curious so looking at them, it looks like it could be like body organs.
Yeah,
And I'm not
definitely.
sure if it's like from animals or from humans. Like I'm wondering
Hmm.
if, and of course sculpture can exist just as abstract sculpture, but considering what your current body of work is, I can't help but think that it's some reference to a body. Is
Hmm.
that what you were thinking about when you were creating them?
Yeah,
Mhm.
definitely thinking about body parts, mostly like innards, I think.
Yeah, yeah.
But yeah, definitely referencing
Especially this
the
one.
body. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And human body, female body.
Yeah, and it looks violent. Like it looks like
Hmm.
these, like I don't know, like intestines, just like kind of
Yeah.
plopped on a plate and then carefully photographed. It's this really interesting. Um, I don't know. It seems like a really violent action imposed on
Hmm.
something that is supposed to be contained and protected.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really interesting way to think about it, actually. Um, but yeah, definitely was thinking about, um, I mean, when you think about like a uterus, for example, what
Yeah,
you just
totally,
said,
totally.
that's we can think about it that way, right? Like it's
Hmm.
this thing that's inside of us, but it's so contested and people care so much and there's so much violence enacted on it. So I definitely was thinking about like what's inside of us that has now become, a topic of not just conversation, but I mean, political unrest,
Completely,
Um,
completely.
yeah, so definitely thinking about your insides kind of coming out.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And one more thing I want to ask you about, and it wasn't a question that I had planned, it just kind of came up in us talking, was
Mhm.
your involvement in crit groups.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so first maybe we could talk about what a crit group is, and then maybe if we
Yeah.
can kind of give advice to listeners as to how to find one,
Yeah,
and the
definitely.
benefits of them. Yeah, so one you mentioned
Yeah.
was it New York Crit Group?
Yeah, New York City Crit Club is
New
one of
York City
them that
Crit
I
Club.
did.
Okay.
They're a pretty big, they're a nonprofit, but they're a pretty big organization, and
Hmm.
they have different classes that you can take. Some are in person if you're in the city, but there's also a lot of virtual options as well. There's crit groups, they have residency programs, they have a lot of different things, and they're all like working artists and art professionals that run them. So I was in that last summer, and then also I was in a smaller group with called Boss Crit, and they're a group of women that started a critique group after graduate school in order to just extend that crit ability and have that community. And they're based out of Boston, so I think I was following them on Instagram, and I applied to be in their group. If you're a Boston based person, they're like a wonderful group to get in touch with and involved with because they're very active. I was like one of the only people from New York, so I think I was a little bit separated from them just because I wasn't as close, and a
Yeah.
lot of them sort of knew each other from that. But I think their group is growing, um, and so I just applied to be in that, and it was free. New York City Crit Club is you do pay for. And then now I'm in a group at CPW, which is the Center for Photography in Woodstock, which
Oh
is
yeah.
actually in Kingston.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah, so I'm in a crit group there that is 6 months long, and we meet once a month. And I get to show my work twice.
That's
So
amazing.
yeah,
And
it's
are you doing this
really
remotely?
awesome.
Because a lot of them, I know
That's in person.
You're up in the Albany
Yeah,
area, but so
yeah.
one is in New York City, one was in Boston, one was in Hudson Valley.
Yeah, so New York City Crit Club and Boss Crit were all virtual, and
Okay.
then CPW is in person. So I'm about an hour from Kingston, so it's only once a month. And a friend of mine that lives here is also in it, so we carpool.
Oh, that's
And
amazing.
Yeah. So I would say, I mean, it took me a little while to sort of get into that, but it's really nice to have community, especially after school, and just have people to show your work to and get that supportive feedback. It also holds you accountable a little bit, right? So like I showed my images from Your Fingers Have No Muscles, my last crit, my next crit is in May. And I'm like, oh, I have to make
You
something
have
for
to
this.
make
Like,
work.
yeah, I have
That's
to make work.
incredible.
And I try to do studio visits with friends that are local and local artists. And, I will just cold email people and be like, hey, do you want to do a studio visit? Just so that I kind of have that momentum to keep doing stuff. I have a studio visit with a friend on Friday, and this has been an insane week, but I was like, I got to get in the studio today because I need to like make something for this critique.
Awesome.
So
Awesome.
it definitely helps. It helps a lot. Yeah.
And did you say, so for the New York City Crit Club, you have to pay? Do you also have to apply to do it?
I don't think so. So I think with New
Cool.
York City Crit Club, you just join. They offer financial aid, which I think is an important thing to point out because the classes are somewhat expensive, but
Okay.
I was offered financial aid for one, which made it affordable for me to join. Boss Crit, I did apply for it. It was a pretty simple application and it was free. I don't know if they're looking for people for this summer. This was probably like around the time last year that I applied for it. So if they're
Okay.
opening it up again, it's probably open. And then CPW, you pay for and you can just join. Yeah, CPW is phenomenal because it's photo based. And so if you are really looking for that photo voice from your group, they're a really good option. And they have a lot of workshops and classes and stuff that they offer, but that is in person. So, you got to be able to get there. Yeah.
Well, Allison, thanks so much for sharing not just
Yeah.
that wildly helpful information, but everything we spoke about your practice and your work. It was so nice to touch base. And
Yeah,
thanks for
definitely.
joining us.
Of course. Thank you for having me and for your insightful comments. I appreciate it.
All right, listeners, that's all for this week. Please be sure to tune in next week as I will be speaking with Sarah J. Winston about her self-portraiture practice that works to capture her experience of living with MS. We also talk about her process of publishing art books. Hope to see you all then. Have a safe week. Bye-bye.